everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. My name is Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And a question that I've been asked a lot, because I worked and still occasionally work in the shark diving industry, is about the ethics of shark diving and baiting sharks for photography purposes and things like that. So we thought we'd talk about that a little bit today and give you guys our thoughts on it, pros, cons, and all that kind of stuff.
And I think it is a kind of a tricky area to talk about because, you know, really from the outset, the only, time I would ever consider baiting any subject is kind of with sharks. Yeah. So it is something of an outlier as an underwater photographer. I mean, I do put, bait out for the birds in my garden in the form of a little feeder, but I'm not actually taking photos of them. I just give them food to eat. But, when it comes to pretty much everything else, I'm, anyone who's dived with me knows that I'm a very, hands-off type of photographer. Really don't like that in my own photography, and I don't like to dive with people who dive like that. So sort of, I very much prefer natural encounters and actually feel that they're often better for photography irrespective. But that said, and perhaps people might say, you hypocrite immediately, I have done many shark baiting dives. We don't go down specifically to feed sharks. We're not trying to, give them their rations or anything like that. It's very much about using the presence of bait in the water to attract them close enough for photography, because there is no doubt that, the majority of swimming species of sharks, you're not going to get close enough to them to take photos without bait in most normal situations. And therefore, in order to see those sharks, baiting is good. And I think that the point I would make is that I've dived all around the world, and in many, many places you visit, you don't see those species of sharks.
Yeah.
You don't see the reef sharks. You don't see the, the pelagic sharks. And yet, in the countries that do have baiting, and I'd say the Bahamas is a great example of that, you see healthy populations everywhere. So there's no doubt that when sharks are given a value to the community, sadly, it's, perhaps that economic argument is the strongest of all when it comes to conservation. And I would say that, irrespective of pictures, when the countries that do make sharks a priority, in terms of a financial priority for conservation, they do a really good job of conservation. And the countries that maybe don't do such a good value. So I find that as good an argument as any as to why I'm happy to get involved. But I know, Matt, you've done so much more, shark diving, and particularly on the side of, I've never, touched the bait on any shark dive I've ever been on, never been involved in that side of things at all. But I'm in the, I'm usually in the water when the bait arrives, and I'm, it's in whatever's, left is long gone before I get out. So I don't know anything about that. So yeah, I'd really be keen to hear your experience, particularly from working in the industry.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on this whole topic, and I'm asked about it a lot because I've been in this community for a while. And the first thing I will always say, and it's a bit cliche because it's, everybody says it, but it's like people will protect the things they love and they'll protect the things that they care about. And you already said it with regards to a lot of the big predatory sharks that, live in our oceans. You never see them just randomly, and especially not for pictures. So if you don't have a way of showing people these animals in their habitats, nobody's going to care about them. Nobody's going to see them. Nobody's going to have any incentive to go see them, and if they can't go see them, who cares?
Where you are, there's plenty of them being hooked out the water all the time.
Yes.
They need those friends. Yeah.
Yes. So, I'm against, like you said, I prefer all of my wildlife encounters to be natural, and I'm against, baiting just about anything. But I think with regards to sharks, in a lot of places, it's necessary just to allow people, put photography aside, to allow people to go and see sharks in their environment and get to experience them as, the amazing animals that they are. So I worked on a shark diving boat. I still sometimes will go out there and be a safety diver, but I did safety diving and I was a feeder. And selfishly, feeding sharks is a very, very cool job. It's a lot of fun, and I do sometimes miss actually being the one, kind of conducting the dive, for lack of a better term. Um, but the best feeling was when you would bring somebody out who's never. We had people who've never seen the ocean, they've never been snorkeling, none of that, or they've done all that and they've never seen sharks. And then you bring them out there. Maybe they're nervous, maybe they're hyped. But when they get out of the water and they're like, that was the coolest effing thing I've ever done. Cool. Now you have somebody who cares
Mm.
about a shark because they got to experience it, which never would happen if you didn't bait them in. And there are certain species like lemon sharks. If you just go out into the ocean, smack the surface of the water, you can bring lemon sharks in and they'll hang out with you because that's just how they are as a species. But those bulls, hammerheads, great whites, the tigers usually. You're never going to get encounters with those species if you don't have bait in the water. And those species especially are some of the ones that are hardest hit by fishermen or people who just they see a shark, they're going to shoot it or stab it. And half the probably 75% of the sharks that we see in Florida have some sort of either fishing related wound, a stab wound, a gunshot wound, all that kind of stuff. And largely, I think that's ignorance plays a part in that. People just see a shark and they're like, oh, it's evil, kill it. Um, which obviously is not the correct response to that, but is sort of an understandable one if you've never been in the water with them and experienced them as anything other than just taking the fish off your line or accidentally biting somebody in the murky shallows.
Yeah, I'd also say that looking at my T-shirt with the Oceanic on it, you can see it very well with the microphone there. But I would also say that when there are shark encounters where we don't need bait to have good encounters, we don't use bait.
Yeah, right.
This is from the Red Sea, this T-shirt, and I'm going to the Red Sea in a few weeks' time to dive with Oceanics. We never, ever use any bait on those trips because the Oceanics are curious enough to come and, if you swim out into their environment, into that open ocean environment, around the offshore reefs, and you hang out in that environment, if there's one around, it'll come in and check you out. Yeah. Now, of course, if you had bait in that environment, it would come in more, but, we don't want to use bait. We like those natural encounters. And, so it's something we go to as a necessity. But I can also speak to that point you were raising about just general public awareness of what's out there. 15 years in the UK, nobody had any idea that we had blue sharks off the UK.
Yeah.
And, then, a few people started to, or first one and then maybe one or two, started to run blue shark encounter dives where they'd not use bait, but they'd use a bag of, charm and things in a bag, not offering any provisioning, but just hanging in the water, creating a scent in an offshore environment a long way off the short coast. And they could bring blue sharks in and take photos. And I was, one of that first group of photographers that got photos of them. The photos were very widely published. They got, seen through big competitions as well. And now, you pick up a nature magazine, even like a birding nature magazine, and they'll talk about, isn't it amazing that we've got blue sharks in the UK? And suddenly the whole conservation community is really excited about having blue sharks and this amazing predator. And, blue sharks are, I think, the most fished shark in the world. Yeah. They don't even tell you how many they catch each year. They just tell you in millions of tons of how many they catch each year because they catch so many of them. And, the fact that we have those photos, and those photos still get used and used and used, and they get used as wildlife, pictures. And they've become part of British wildlife. People say, what's your favorite British predator? And people now go, oh, well, is it the fox or is it the blue shark? It's the blue shark, And suddenly it's like, it's on everyone's agenda. And that wouldn't have happened if people hadn't gone out and seen them. And in that case, it wouldn't have happened if we hadn't taken photos as well.
Well, that's the other thing too. Photography is a powerful medium, and you can use that to change all sorts of things. So with regards to photography, again, if you are lucky enough to see one of those big predatory sharks just on a dive, 99 times out of 100, it's way too far away to take pictures, or it sees you and it's gone because most sharks want nothing to do with you. So if you want to get those compelling pictures, you're going to have to bring them in somehow. And with the exception of certain species like lemons or the oceanics or things like that, you're going to have to use bait to get them close enough. And there's also the debate of, does it change their behavior and things like that? That I think is largely dependent on where you're doing it and how you're doing it. So here, most of the sharks that we have in Florida are migratory. So they're moving through, they're here for a few months and they carry on. If they were relying on us for food, they'd starve to death immediately.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's changing their behavior. And again, I'm sure there's people out there who would argue with me about that. Um, but there are places where I would think, or where I do think that it's probably not the best idea. So there's,
I think, though, that in general, successful species are adaptable. They're able to adapt and make use of a temporary food source, of a one-off food source, and it doesn't
yeah,
change their behavior. It's just part of being adaptable. When I was a kid, we used to have milk delivered to houses in the UK in glass bottles, and they used to put silver tinfoil over the top to keep the milk fresh. And within a few years of that starting, small birds learned that they could peck a hole in the milk bottle top and drink a little bit of milk. And that behavior is not part of their natural history.
yeah.
And when milk stopped being delivered that day, it didn't, the birds didn't all suddenly survive. It's just part of a species being adaptable, and successful species are adaptable to make use of opportunities.
Yeah.
If you're designed to eat worms, like a small bird is or whatever, and another good food source comes along, you're not going to you're not going to be successful as a species unless you're able to adapt. And when that food source goes away, if you're not able to adapt back, so the species that are around us are the ones that are adaptable and able to make use of these things.
So there's one that I've learned about kind of recently that I do think is probably an issue. I think if you're going to be shark diving, please make sure you know the operator that you're going with. Please make sure they know what they're doing and they
Yeah,
have.
maybe we should come back to that point and like have a list of what to look out for in
Oh,
an
well, yeah.
operator. So yeah,
But
I'll ask you that after you make this point about.
yeah, what I am getting to is what I do what I what gives me cause for concern is when people who are not shark diving or who have not learned, especially how to feed it properly or safely, are just taking bait out with sharks and going willy-nilly with it. So there's a very well-known dive site in Washington State and during the summer months, six gill sharks show up, and they've done it historically, but it's usually small juveniles, like 5, 6 foot, 7 foot six gills. This past year, I was seeing pictures pop up, and I'm thinking to myself, like, these don't look like juvenile six gills, they look enormous. And then it comes out that there's now 12, 13, 14 foot six gills showing up at this site. And then it comes out that people are taking bait there and baiting the six gills. These are not shark divers. There's not a shark diving community in Washington. This is a training dive site where a ton of divers go, and now big predatory sharks are showing up there looking because they're being drawn up by food. And I heard of one instance where a guy who brought a bait bag out, one of the adult six gills got a hold of the bait bag while it was attached to him and just shredded it and sent bait flying all over a bunch of people who were there not shark diving. I think those kind of situations can be very, very dangerous, and I would absolutely not recommend just random people going out, whether they're boat diving or shore diving, and feeding whatever shark happens to be in the area. Because especially at a place like that where you don't know how, nobody feeds six gills. Nobody's going to know how they're going to respond over time to being fed. And I think especially with them, they're large and slow moving when normally, and they're kind of goofy looking. And people are like, oh, they're probably pretty harmless. Well, they're one of the largest predatory sharks on Earth, and I have an uncomfortable feeling that if something goes wrong there, either all of the six gills are going to get caught and killed, and or they're going to shut down one of the best dive sites in the entire country because something went wrong there.
Then to make this more of a general point is, say I'm a relatively new underwater photographer. I want to get photos of sharks, and I'm happy to go on shark baited dives. How do I choose, given my level of experience, how can I kind of tell without doing it, who's a good operator? What are things to look for? And what are things that might be red flags kind of in an operation? Because there are lots of shark dives all around the world. And I think it's a mistake to think that, all shark dives are the same. I can go with an operation that's been, got 30 years experience, but these guys, they just started last week, but it's going to be the same because it's just another shark dive. So kind of what would be some things you'd look out for, or questions to ask if you're emailing an operator?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that especially now in the age of social media, like a lot of these companies will post videos and stuff from their dives. You could kind of get an insight as to how they are run, without having to necessarily ask anybody or do any more real research than that. But I would say that, I would not try out a brand new shark operation. It's not something I would recommend doing unless, the person who's running it, broke away from somebody else and they've been doing it already and they have it. That happens here all the time, where somebody will have been working for a company for 15 years doing shark stuff and they go and start their own. That's one thing. But I would always try to talk to somebody who has been with an operator first, if you can get a hold of that, if you can get a hold of a person like that. And unfortunately, and I'm sure you've experienced this, there's oftentimes you just have to kind of go and do an experience and be like, that was either amazing or it's something I will not do with these people again. And whenever I was working on the boat, we'd get it sometimes where somebody would be like, oh, I went with this operator, and I didn't feel especially safe, but I didn't know, so I went and did it anyway, and now I know not to go with them again.
Well, I mean, on that though, I've been on a shark dive. I'm not going to go into the details of it, that I thought was quite unsafe.
Well, so
and
I
was there with a group of friends, and like a couple of us have done quite a lot of shark diving, and we were both. That was really not safe, not well managed at all. And then there was two others in the group who were another photographers who hadn't done many shark dives, and they were like, "Wow, that was so cool! It was great. That shark was doing all these funny things." And like, because they were just of the impression that this is completely safe, and like, it must be safe because it's a tourist activity. And like, we were like, no, that was like really out of control. It was really badly managed. It was, and so yeah, it's hard to judge because on that situation, the experienced shark divers were, that wasn't safe, and the inexperienced ones were like, that was so cool. I was, because they didn't know to be scared.
Yeah. So we get that too, so I've had instances where I've been either safetying or feeding in the water, and I've spent enough time with most of these shark species where I'll be like, nah, something, and it doesn't, you don't have to necessarily, no event happens where that like switches things up. All of a sudden, just like something feels off, and it's it's not how it was 30 seconds ago. Like something has definitely changed, and in those situations, I would always usually just pull people out of the water, or if they're not experienced, I'd be like, hey, go huddle closer to the boat, stay over there, and we'll kind of suss this out and see how it plays out. But there are operators out there who are kind of Wild Westy, where the crazier it gets, the more they enjoy it. But the average person, they just want to see sharks, or if they're photographers, they just want to photograph sharks. They don't need a whole big production and a show, which is when I think that things can go wrong. Like you said, if it was getting nuts, you've experienced with sharks, you could tell that it wasn't safe. And those are the operators where I would hesitate to go with ever again. Because chances are it's not necessarily a one-off, especially if they didn't like usher you out of the water. And
I think what you were saying before about how they speak about it, if they're trying to make it a show and entertainment, it's probably, and they're talking about all the hyperbole, they're probably not running the sort of shark dive. Whereas I think a respectful shark operator is, we have these great close encounters with these predators. We're not feeding them. We're just using baits, pull them in. I think as a new photographer, I would definitely, don't start necessarily with the large predatory species. I think the more experience you've had with lemon sharks or reef sharks, that in places that they're fed regularly and they're kind of pretty habituated, it'll allow you to build that experience. But I think, one thing I would say is, two things I would say actually is, first thing that guided me a lot in shark diving is, if you have to be brave, there's probably something wrong with how it's being run. Mm-hmm. Like a good shark dive shouldn't require you to be brave to do it. It should be well run and sensibly planned.
So real quick before I lose this thought, 'cause it kind of ties in. Whenever I would give the shark briefing, if I was the feeder that day, is I would always be like, the calmer you are, the better this will all be. The sharks will be the sharks are going to be calm. You just have to be calm too. They can because they will feed off your energy. Like they can tell if you're getting all sorts amped up. They'll be like, "Ooh, I'm going to go check that person out." So yeah, it's okay to be nervous because they're sharks are big and
Yeah,
potentially
predators.
dangerous. But if the calmer you are, the calmer it can be in the water, and it's nice and calm and safe for everybody. And that's generally how those dives go. If it's the enjoyable ones, at least, is it's nice and relaxed and chill. And I would always tell people like, don't go swimming after sharks. Let me bring them to you. Like just float, hang out. That's all you got to do, and it'll go much more smoothly. But yeah, if there's sharks flying out of the water as soon as you get to the site, and fish blood everywhere, maybe not the best one to start with.
And then and then the second thing I'd say is, just because these are tourist activities, just because you've seen other people do them, don't assume that these are not wild, potentially dangerous animals. They are predatory animals. They're not out to go around eating people, but you start putting bait into that environment, and there is a risk there, and you need to be sensible. You need to make sure you're managing your dive. You understand how everything's working. You understand if there's a current running, there's a direction that the bait and the smell and the scent and all the exciting things are. And that's the direction the sharks are coming. And if you start going towards the sharks, chances are you're going to get yourself between the bait and the sharks, which means that you are between the shark and the food and you smell of food.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to happen eventually if you do that again and again? Whereas if you're mindful, I think you're going to have a really, really good experience. So I think it's important to have that personal responsibility of understanding everything. So you go into it well, and then you can have really wonderful encounters.
And the other thing too is, like you said, personal accountability. If you don't feel safe in the water for whatever reason, just either tell some, like if you're on a scuba dive, maybe it's a bit more difficult to come up by yourself. But especially if you're doing one of the free dive trips, just get out of the water. It's not worth, however, if you aren't feeling good in there, it's not necessarily the best to power through. I would recommend getting out of the water, recompose yourself, and then get back in if you want to, if you're on one of the free dives. And if you're on a scuba dive, especially here, most of the shark diving is deep. If you don't feel comfortable, I would just come up and call it. It's not worth staying down at 100 feet and being all like this the whole time. But the sharks they're amazing. Like photographers and divers love sharks for a reason. And I don't think baiting is the evil that a lot of people make it out to be. I don't think it changes their behavior, but it has to be done in a smart way. And I think long term, it's probably a net positive for sharks and their long-term survival, is to be able to bring them in close to people, let people experience them in their environment, even though it's not, totally natural if you have bait in the water. But I think it's, and that's what I know. I said this on a podcast I was on, is I think if it's a net positive for the sharks, I think it's probably an okay thing to do.
Given that there are species that has a lot of negative out there.
Yes, exactly. And they're not doing the best. So whatever we can do to help them, I think it's probably all right.
I think the final thing I would say is that if you do go out and do these dives and you do get some fantastic pictures, don't squirrel them away on a hard drive. Get them out there. If you've gone on a shark dive and, however you feel about baiting or whatever, if you've got nice shark pictures, get out there, share them on social media, but share them with a good message. Don't pretend these are, dumb puppy dogs or anything like that. Say, these are, it was a real privilege to spend time in their environment. You don't have to hide away from the fact you use bait. Say, we use bait, so we got the chance to see these amazing wild animals. Yeah. The size, their power was incredibly impressive. But I think sharing those pictures makes the dive a worthwhile investment, both for you and the sharks. And I think that serves the greater good. If you hide the pictures away, never show anyone those pictures, then maybe, just shark diving for your own self, enjoyment, and then you never share the experience with anyone. I think then you might start to question, is it really a net positive? But as soon as you're telling the stories about sharks, as soon as you're showing the pictures about sharks, I think it's much easier to argue that it's a net positive experience.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, I mentioned that the photography is a powerful medium, and if you can show people a pretty picture of a cool shark, maybe like, oh, that looks really cool, maybe I want to do that, and then they go do it. Now you have a new shark diver who cares about them, and maybe they won't be demonized or anything like that anymore, and then that person it snowballs. So it's a complicated issue for sure. But I think it's an important one I think it's an important discussion to have, and I think, like we said, net positive for the Sharks. So
yeah, and if you've got different opinions to us, which is absolutely fine, we're both probably quite similar in our opinion. Do feel free to get in the comments and leave your opinions. We're not necessarily going to answer them all back to try and talk you around to our way of thinking. I think it's great to have those opinions out there for people to watch the podcast and read your take on things. It doesn't have to be about arguing our way to a conclusion. It can just be about, these are my points and this is why I feel this way about the situation. Okay, that's a great place for us to wrap up. So thanks for watching the Underwater Photography Show. And we'll be back again soon with another episode.